Your emotional state is actually indicative of how stressed you are. So when I came across that, I went, wow, that's huge. How can I put this into a structure to explain how this works and why this works? So then I had to look at stress and what that meant and the behaviours behind stress. So that's so that's where we went. So let's define what stress is, what I mean by stress. Stress to me is, and this is my definition, you are stressed if you're struggling to achieve something, or you're straining against something, you're stuck in a rut, so you actually can't make decisions, or you're coming from a position of lack, lack of resources or lack of anything really, or you're in pain or have tension anywhere in your body. So that kind of covers everything. Emotionally, physically, mentally and spiritually. And so that's what I was looking at, the holistic kind of approach. So having looked at that, I went, okay, let's look at the physical things that happen when somebody is stressed. So when somebody is stressed, what is happening is they're responding to something that has happened, or it's a thought or it's a feeling. And so the stress response mechanism was originally designed in our human physiology to respond to a real threat. Some wild beast is going to try and attack you, so your life is in danger. So you go like that, and you either stay there and fight it, or you run away, or you freeze, And so there's those actions. So that's one aspect of stress. So physiologically what happens as well is the blood and the water rushes from the head and it goes to the big muscles so that you can do these actions, right? So if you keep draining the blood and the water from the head, see, this is like an electricity station. It needs water, it needs fluid to operate. So if you keep draining it, you're actually going to cause dehydration and you're going to cause inflammation. And that's how disease starts, through that. So that's one aspect. So if you look at the other aspect is physiologic. What do people do when they actually have a stressful thought or a stress or trigger affects them? So physically what happens is they go like this. They go, and what happens is they actually bend their head back and then they bend forward and the tailbone bends forward as well. And then what happens is they actually bring their knees up like this. It's though they're going into a ducking position, and that ducking position is actually your primary survival position, and that's the fetal position in the womb. So what that means is when you're in stress, you have a lot of stress stored in what they call the psoas muscle, and the psoas muscle allows us to bend forward, okay? So what happens when people, all these methodologies have arisen out of stress, because stress affects the head first through the senses, the eyes, the ears, the nose, the mouth, and the, your hairs on the back of your neck go up. So when a stressful event occurs or a stressful trigger is actually activated, you go into all sorts of reactions. Your physiology goes into all sorts of reactions, and then that affects them mentally and so on. So what happens is, out of that, all of these people have developed a whole lot of alternate therapies, like there's craniosacral, and there's people that deal with the neck, and people who deal with the spine, and physiotherapists deal with the muscles, and the people who deal with the psoas muscle, and reflexology, and there's all kinds of therapies developed out of that to actually help people overcome their stress. So it's kind of like, okay, when I was looking at that, I said there's something else going on that is kind of more basic, because they're kind of symptoms. They're all symptoms of stress. And if you're fixing just the symptom, you may not get to the real underlying issue. So when Bruce Lipton said that 95% of all that we do is a habit, people think that they're making decisions every day, and they're not. They're just kind of going through the motion. I went, okay, well, let's have a look at the research in habits, that research. And Charles Duhigg has written some books about this. And habits have three aspects. There's a cue, there's a behaviour, and there's a reward. So the cue for stress is whatever's happened in the past, some trigger, and I'll talk about that later, some trigger like that, and then you act out the behaviour, and the behaviour is like this, and then you go into that action, that's the physical behaviour, and then you reward yourself. In my case, when I was stressed, I used to drink a lot, you know. Some people eat chocolate, some people go for coffee, some people do smokes or whatever it is, you know. So you reward yourself or try to get over that stressful event. So the interesting thing, today's research, is people are actually doing exercise for the psoas muscle so that you can actually release the stress from that. And yes, I use that as well. But when I looked at part of that habitual response to stress, it was this. So what that meant was how you breathe and what you did with your breathing apparatus. That was the key for me, because your breath is, if you don't have breath, you don't have life, yeah? So, and I found also too that the link between the conscious and the unconscious is the breath. So if you can gain hold of how you breathe and change that aspect of your subconscious and get hold of that aspect of your subconscious, then you will actually be able to change how you behave, okay? So the thing about where stress comes from, and this is kind of interesting, people think stress comes from that person out there or the workforce or, you know, something like that. There's different kinds of stress. There's situational stress, there's physical stress, there's mental stress, there's emotional stress, and so on. So the physical stress is really easy to overcome. You know, your desk and your chair might be too low or whatever. The light might be not bright enough, you know, that kind of thing. So those are easily fixed. In the workplace, you might have bullies or harassment or people above you that don't have proper communication skills. So if they don't have that, you're going to be stressed if you're already stressed. But the real cause of stress and the underlying issues is the emotional stress, because the emotions affect everything that you do. And the emotions are the language of the body, how the body actually communicates with your spirit and says, look, I'm in pain, I'm in distress, I actually need some help. And quite often what we do, and if we're not taking any notice, it forms a pain somewhere in your body or tension. And then quite often we ignore that for years and years and years, and that becomes a disease. So it's kind of like, okay, what do we need to do? How do we overcome this, you know, and so on. So then I looked at further back in the research, and I found that really how stress and why stress is there and it keeps repeating is because it's an emotional stress. And so emotional stress is about the beliefs that you formed in your formative years between the ages of 0 to 6. And these patterns have been handed down or downloaded from your parents or your primary caregivers. So they're trying to teach you to survive. So stress is about survival, and it's about conflict, and it's about suppression of emotions. It's about not being able to express those emotions. So way back then, in the period of 0 to 6, you're just downloading programs to survive all the time. Some of these programs that you've downloaded are, in fact, incorrect and just unworkable, and it restricts the child's behaviour. And so what happens is, if the parent keeps telling the child, look, you're not good enough, or you're unacceptable, you're not lovable, or whatever it is, the child will form an opinion about that and say, and therefore, when this happens, I'm unlovable, or I don't deserve success, or whatever it is. So in that formative period, they're carrying forward these beliefs, and the beliefs shape your experiences in life and also shape how you perceive life. You know, people perceive life like this, or this, or this, or this, you know. So people carry through these behaviours and these beliefs. And at the base of all stress is actually two things: how you respond to stress, that actually physical action, and the belief system. So what I do in my first lot of training is deal with how you respond to stress, because if you can gain hold of how you respond to stress, you resolve it, you know, once and for all. So I just want to explain a bit about the difference between what I do and what stress management people do. Stress management says stress is there, we can't do anything about it. Let's just put it over here or manage it. Let's go for a walk or have a massage or whatever it is. So you're always coming from a negative position. You're not actually resolving the stress. So what I do is say, okay, if we can change how we respond to stress, what I'm going to do is lift you above the line into a positive state the whole time so that you're coming from a positive state. So if we can do that, then when another stressful event occurs, you might just dip down, but you'll come back to that. So what I'm doing is actually retraining you for a increased baseline resilience to stress, so that it's like building your muscle, and you build your muscle so that when stressful events occur, you can cope really, really easily, but you're actually in positive the whole time. So that's the basis of what I do. And so as I said, it was kind of a combination of things, observing, looking at the behaviour and the patterns and saying, okay, if everything you do in life is a habit, why can't we change the habit of how you respond to stress? You'll never actually change the whole thing because it's ingrained permanently. But what you can do is change how you respond to stresses that aren't real. Because the stresses, the things that we respond to are somebody says something negative to us, or we don't get the raise we want, or someone harasses us, something like that. And that's an emotional issue. So if we can build our emotional intelligence and our emotional resilience, then that will solve how we respond to stress. So the thing about stress is we've actually continued to train ourselves to respond to imagined or perceived threats in the same way that we respond to real threats. We don't have a lot of real threats on our life in our world generally, right? So we have been trained by our primary caregivers throughout our lives to respond to imaginary stresses, watch out for this and don't do that and be aware of that kind of thing. So some people, when they hear that, they, act out kind of depression, or some people go into the anxious state. So what I'm saying is, if we can stop how we're responding to perceived or non-life-threatening stress, then we'll actually have overcome how we respond to stress in general.